We spent all last month observing the wonderful aspects of creation. God made a home and He created people to live in it. Our parents, Adam and Eve, lived in paradise. Now, we don't have any notion of how much time passed between chapters 2 and 3. We don't know how long our parents enjoyed their home, but clearly it did not last. And the Word of God accounts for the difference between that paradise and the day in which we live, the condition of the world in which we find ourselves. And that explanation is in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. I want to invite you to turn there, please. In your Pew Bible, the reading is on page 5. We're going to look at or read just the first 6 verses this morning. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." "You certainly will not die," the serpent said to the woman. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. And thereby, in disobedience, brought an end to paradise on earth. This is what theologians call fall from grace, or simply the fall. It is the first sin. It is the first act of disobedience against our Creator. The fall is staggering. It's hard to imagine because it happened so easily, so swiftly. The fall, as we just read, is no great drama of struggle. Only the disgusting and discouraging account of how our folks literally ate us out of house and home. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, as Paul writes in Romans 1:25, and found out too late the terrible cost of the bargain they struck. I want to suggest to you this morning that Genesis 3:1-6 is a story for our own age, our own time. For we are bent on acquiring knowledge. In the last 500 years or so of human history, the discipline of science has been hijacked in order to serve an atheistic or anti-God bent. One of the driving motivations of secular society is to seek knowledge apart from God. We hardly pause to consider whether the knowledge we find is good or evil, whether it helps or hurts or both. We just plunge ahead, unencumbered by a moral point of view that we inherit from our Creator. In the process, our knowledge has created as many problems as it has solved. What has not changed, however, is our human nature to misuse and our tendency to our own self-destruction. Here's a quick example. We uncovered the secret of making energy from the atom, and what did we do with it? We weaponized it and made it an instrument of war. Science and knowledge for its own sake is not a virtue. And the other point at which this applies to us, I think, is that the fall is also our own individual story. That we began life in innocence and at some point rejected the good and true commands of God in order to go our own way instead. So as we begin to look at this morning, we take a brief moment to consider the fall and what happened there. Let's own it. Let's not make this a story that's just in our indeterminate past, but instead, let's understand it's our story too. There are notes in your bulletin for following along with the message. We're going to look at just two things this morning, just the first two. We're going to answer the question, who or what is this serpent? And then we're going to answer the question, what was its deception? Who or what is this serpent? Well, interestingly, in the account of Genesis, the author offers no description of the man or the woman other than that they were naked. He actually tells us a fair amount more about the serpent than he does any other character in the story. And so we need to pay close attention for that reason alone. What does he tell us? He tells us that the serpent was more crafty or shrewd than the other wild animals. Now there's two words in that description we want to focus on. The first is crafty, or shrewd, or sly. That's a pretty small space in which to write, so maybe the word sly would be better, a bit easier. It's an ambiguous word, actually, in the Bible. It could be a virtue or it can be a vice. In Proverbs, it's held forth as a quality that wise people will cultivate. Craftiness or shrewdness is a kind of flexibility to the moment and an ability to adapt to the demands of life. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, Jesus urges us to be as wise as serpents, but as harmless as doves. But when craftiness or shrewdness is harnessed to do evil, when it's used for self-interest, then it becomes a vice. And we read this in Exodus and in Joshua and in Job. This craftiness can be good or it can be evil. This animal was so crafty, so shrewd, that it not only knew how to speak, but it knew how to manipulate people with its words. It also tells us that it was one of the wild animals. And that word wild, we learned earlier, means the predatory animals. So it's kind of scary to think of God having created a predator that was wise, crafty, shrewd. But here it is in creation, and so we ask, why did God create such a being? Well, folks, if you're going to endow Adam and Eve with free will, but you don't give them any choice, how free are they? You understand? There had to be an advocate in the garden for the dark side, for the other side. There had to be someone who speaks. From the rest of the Bible, we learned that Eve was deceived by its cunning. That's what Paul wrote to the Corinthians. In Revelation, it refers to Satan as that ancient serpent. So is this a serpent? Is this a literal animal? Or is it a symbol? Are we to take this as some kind of word picture? Well, in the Bible, the serpent is used as a symbol for evil. And God declared serpents to be unclean animals, that is, they were not suitable for food or to be sacrificed as an offering. And in fact, in the Bible, the serpent is the most unclean animal. So if the writer of Genesis were going to pick an animal for this role, he would symbolic event. This is meant to be understood as literal, as historic, as it actually happened, as written here. So how do we put all of this together? I think we understand that this animal had been created by God to serve that purpose in the garden, but it was directed and it was animated by Satan himself. So the enemy was present even there in paradise. So we've understood now what the serpent is. What is its deception? Why does it deserve the title crafty or shrewd? The serpent's deception was this. It went to Eve, to the woman, as God's commands had been given to Adam, the man. If you look at the text, God gave a command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. The woman is not created until chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. So the serpent went to the one who presumably had not personally heard the command. Ladies, when your husband receives word of something, does he always come home and tell you right away? Are you sometimes maybe the last to know? Does he always get it right? I think maybe in this situation, human nature took over and the woman only knew the command secondhand. And when we know something secondhand, we don't necessarily have the same kind of feeling about it, do we? As a personal experience. So we see the craftiness of the serpent right away in the person that he approaches. The serpent questioned the commandment. It caused diversion. It caused a diversion from the commandment to the object of the commandment. In verse 1, the serpent deliberately misquotes God. This is a tactic to couch the commandment in its own terms. And we have seen that in spades in this election process, haven't we? People defining things in terms favorable to their position. It's phrased as a question in a passive-aggressive way as misleading, because questions don't usually excite opposition as much as statements. Now you notice the woman's reply. She's misquoting God here. She clearly did not receive or understand the commandment correctly because God never said don't touch it. She added that bit. So this indicates to us that that the woman had not understood or received God's command rightly or fully. And also notice how this slanders God. These two people are put in a garden full of trees. There's one that they're not to touch. And the enemy focused on the one and caused them to ignore the others. They couldn't see the forest for the tree, literally. They missed out. Because he spoke and he couched his words in such a way that diverted their attention from the generosity of God to the one tree that was forbidden. And I want to tell you something. My theory, this is just a theory, there's absolutely no support for this. My theory is that all the trees in the garden were the same. And that there was one in the middle. It didn't even really stand out by itself, but God chose one. He said that one. And so it looked to them as an arbitrary, random choice. They didn't understand why that one. And so often we don't understand the commands of God, do we? God doesn't require our understanding. He requires our obedience. So we look at things in life and we say, what's the difference? I think maybe Adam and Eve did the same in the garden. Let's notice also that it contradicted the commandment. It caused doubt. And it used half-truths to deceive. It was true that God said that they would die if they ate the fruit of that tree, but he did not say that they would die immediately, and he did not say that it would be a physical death. So the truth of this is that they didn't die immediately. In fact, Genesis tells us that Adam lived to be 930 years old. And it was not a physical death that they died, but a spiritual one. You see, in verse 5, the serpent promised that the fruit would open their eyes, and that promise did come true, but they did not see what they thought they would see. In verse 7, it tells us that they saw that they were naked and were ashamed for the first time. The serpent promised that eating the fruit would make them like God, but the truth of the matter was that they were already like God. That God had already given them his image and his likeness. They didn't need the fruit for that. The serpent promised that they would become like God in verse 5. And then in verse 22, God said that they would have to be banished from the garden because they become like one of us, knowing good and evil. You see, knowledge itself doesn't always lead to good outcomes. In fact, the serpent promised that they would gain knowledge, but the only knowledge that they gained was evil. They already knew good. They had walked with God in the garden. The serpent promised them these things, but the outcome was not what they were led to believe. In fact, the woman was so diverted that she added to the description of the fruit. You see, back in chapter 2, verse 9, God said that all the trees of the field were good for food and pleasing to the eye. This is one reason I think maybe they were all the same. All the trees were good for food and pleasing to the eye. But when Eve thought and said that they're good for food, that's like making an excuse, as we sometimes do when we're tempted to sin. Doesn't really matter, only affects me, on and on we go. She says it's pleasing to the eye, and that's lust, that's materialism. Just because something looks good doesn't mean that it is good. But here's what she added: desirable for wisdom. Where'd she get that idea? What do you think? The serpent planted that in her mind. It was desirable for gaining wisdom. How can a piece of fruit make you smart? Particularly if that fruit is a raisin. How's that going to make you any smarter? How's any vegetable by itself going to make you more healthy? You know, we think these things and we're promised these things, but they're not always what they appear to be. And so the text this morning is a study not just of what happened in history, but what happens to us when we're tempted. And obviously this is no laughing matter, but the first parents of our race have been rightly made the object of some jokes. Now, I've got about a half dozen of them here. I'll just share the two best ones with you. Picture this. An Englishman, a Frenchman, and a Russian are all in a museum viewing a beautiful painting of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And the British man says, "My, look at their reserve. They're calm. They must be British." "Nonsense," the Frenchman says. "They're naked. They're beautiful. Clearly, they're French." The Russian points to the picture and says, "No clothes, no shelter. They have only apple to eat and are being told is paradise. They must be Russian." Adam and Eve had their first fight, and for the first and last time in history, the man got in the last word. here's what he said. Hey, I'll wear the plant in this family. So what can be said about our two parents? Literally, they had it all. But after two deceptive comments from a serpent under the influence of Satan, they chucked it all away. Yes, they were deceived, but they chose, by their own free will, to be like God rather than love God. Now, the application of this truth this morning really is very simple, and it's very immediate and very timely. You have been hearing the ads, you've been reading the statements, you've been subjected to the blitz of advertising, and how hard is it to know how to vote, what to do. And if nothing else, this passage this morning should tell us not to believe everything we hear. One thing you will never hear from this pulpit is an endorsement of any particular candidate or any particular party. However, from time to time in elections there are issues that are of a moral nature. And one of them illustrates the very thing that we've been studying today. There is a ballot initiative that we are voting on Tuesday, Amendment U. And the people advocating for Amendment U are trying to convince us that it's the best way to handle the payday loan industry or predatory lending that goes on in our state. They're lying. U is for usury, which is the biblical word for charging too much interest. And their campaign is a perfect example of what the devil did to our parents in the Garden of Eden. On the other hand, Measure 21 is a sincere attempt approved by churches and church leaders in our community and across our state to bring an end to this kind of predatory practice that binds poor people and holds them in financial hardship. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about, folks. We need to vote no on U and yes on 21, because that's the truth. We don't believe everything we hear, but we test it. And what's the test? The Word of God. What did God say? God said to us, sin is a problem. It's everybody's problem. Here's our solution. Jesus Christ. We're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper today. Celebrate the solution of God. Celebrate His answer to the fall by deciding to follow Jesus. Would you stand, please? Turn your songbooks to number 602. We'll sing the first and second verses, 1 and 2 of 602.